Just to introduce myself, I'm Craig Hilton-Taylor. I work for IUCN in the Biodiversity Assessment and Knowledge team upstairs, and I head up the team that produces the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. And obviously the green status, as you'll hear, is part of the Red List of Threatened Species. Before introducing Molly, I just want to say a few words to set the scene, but Molly will probably go into much more detail about this during her talk. So back in 2012, at the 5th IUCN World Conservation Congress, which was held in the island of Jeju in the Republic of Korea, the IUCN members passed a resolution calling for the development of objective criteria for green list of species, ecosystems, and protected areas. Our protected areas colleagues ran away, they took the initiative and ran away very quickly to develop the green list of protected and conserved areas. It's essentially a certification scheme using the Green List Sustainability Standard. On the species side, the Species Survival Commission established a Species Conservation Success Task Force, co-chaired by Barney Long and Liz Bennett. There are a number of other task force members in the building here today. In fact, we've been having a meeting upstairs on a related matter. They will hopefully sneak into the back of the meeting in due course or join us for drinks afterwards. But I particularly want to pick out Mike Hoffman, who's here today, because Mike essentially drove the whole process to develop the green status up until the IUCN Congress in 2016 in Hawaii. By that point, we realized that the task force could not do this on a voluntary basis. We needed a full-time staff member to develop the emerging system and test it. And one of our task force members, E.J. Mullen-Garland, who many people here will know from the other place, was successful in getting a NERC Knowledge Exchange Fellowship. And through that, we hired Molly in 2017. So on to Molly. Molly did her undergraduate degree at Duke University in North Carolina, and then went on to do a PhD at the University of Central Florida's Conservation Biology program under Reed Noss, who many people here will know very well, or certainly know of. Molly's thesis was on transportation ecology, essentially looking at lethal and sublethal impacts of roads on wildlife ecology and behavior. Molly is now a lecturer in ecology and conservation based in the Department of Biology at the University of Oxford, and her research focuses very much on assessing species recovery, especially the development of the green status of species. And she is now a co-chair of our Green Status Species Working Group or Task Force. She also studies how historical ecology and paleoecology can inform conservation efforts. In her application letter for the position, Molly said, and I quote, "I've noticed that the general mood of a conservation-focused department can sometimes be, for the lack of a better word, despondent. The challenges facing the world's wildlife and wild places can at times seem insurmountable. That is why I'm encouraged by IUCN's efforts to acknowledge positive outcomes with this green list of it's a green list of various things, protected areas and species and so on." So I look forward to hearing if Molly has retained her optimism. She talks to us about what is conservation success and how to go about measuring recovery and conservation impact with the IUCN green status of species. Thank you, Molly.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Craig. I think one thing it's taught me is always be careful what you put in writing, because even 7 years later, it could be quoted back at you. It was a pretty innocuous one. Thank you, Craig. As Craig mentioned, in a former life, I was very much focused on transportation ecology. I know there are some people in the room with an interest in that, but my research focus has taken a very different direction since then. So if that's what you're here for, apologies, you'll be a bit disappointed. But as Craig said, I'm here to talk about the IUCN green status of species, and really part of a sort of world tour to get the word out about what the green status of species is, and why everyone in this room should be excited about it and getting involved with it. Brilliant. And so the idea of a green status of species really boils down and comes from this question on the screen, which is, when is a species conserved? Seems like potentially a simple question, but it can get complicated really quickly. For a long time, as everyone in this room I'm sure knows, we've had a very well accepted way to think about how species conservation status is changing, which is the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, which of course looks at a species extinction risk. And you can say that you might see some conservation success when a species moves from a higher risk category, like critically endangered or endangered, down to a lower risk category like least concern or near threatened. And for decades, this has been one of the primary ways that globally we've conceptualized conservation success. As I said, it is a standardized, established global metric. But the question has been brewing, as Craig alluded to in his introduction over the past decades, is simply avoiding extinction enough when it comes to defining conservation success? So throughout the past decades, we've seen papers like the two on the screen. So Redford's paper, Soule's paper, asking what does it mean to successfully conserve a species? And a lot of it started talking about the ideas of ecological effectiveness and preserving ecological interactions of a species. So an ecologically functional population, not just a minimum viable population. So these ideas were starting to become, really taking shape in the ecological and conservation conversations, but aren't necessarily captured within the red list framing, which I will hasten to say is not a failing of the red list itself. Big fan of the red list over here. The idea that there should be some sort of recovery of species to functional levels as part of our definition of what successful conservation means for a species. Oops. And so if we were to take our red list categories of extinction risk and put alongside them some hypothetical axis of species recovery to functional levels, where we have 0% meaning a species is extinct or extinct in the wild, and 100% means a species is fully recovered to functional levels, how does that interplay with the red list system that we know and love? So it's pretty obvious that if a species is extinct or extinct in the wild on the red list, it corresponds to extinct on our sort of hypothetical spectrum of recovery. But what about if a species is least concern? So not at risk of extinction in the foreseeable future, which is in itself a huge conservation success. But where does that map on our recovery spectrum? Would that correspond to a fully recovered species? Or would it be falling somewhere else on that spectrum? Without a definition of recovery, at least a standardized one that could be applied across all species of animals, plants, and fungi, like the red list can for extinction risk, it can be hard to know. And that's what the green status of species sets out to do. So the IUCN Green Status of Species is an IUCN assessment. It's complementary to the red list of threatened species, and indeed it's, as Craig said, a part of the red list of threatened species. So introducing new metrics of species recovery to the red list framework that's already so well established. And just like the red list, the remit's the same. These assessments can be done for all animals, plants, and fungi. So, as Craig promised, I'll go into a little bit of detail about the history of the development of the green status. Oops, sorry, I don't have quite the control of this clicker that I'd like to. So I'm going to be going through this timeline. So, as Craig mentioned, in 2012, there was an IUCN resolution calling for a green list of species. The idea was that we needed a way to measure species conservation success in a somewhat more comprehensive way than just considering extinction risk. And actually, in addition to just thinking about species, that 2012 IUCN resolution in Jeju, Korea, called for the creation of 3 different green lists. So a green list of species, a green list of ecosystems, and a green list of protected areas. So obviously, I'm going to be talking about the green list of species, which was formally adopted by IUCN in 2021. The green list of protected areas, as Craig said, was really fast off the mark. They had their standards published, accepted, tested by 2017. And we'll talk about some differences between the different methods later on, but they were very quick out of the gate, and that's an important thing to remember. The green list of ecosystems is still in development. So just like the red list of ecosystems borrows heavily from the principles of the red list of threatened species, the green list of ecosystems, which is being developed by my colleague Jess Rowland at Monash University in Australia, will borrow heavily from the principles of the green list of species. So there's some nice parallel there. But the idea is that with these 3 green lists, we would have new metrics of conservation success for species, ecosystems, and protected areas. That would be a global standard that could be applied at the scale of the red list. Focusing in on the green status or the green list of species still at this point in history. The idea was that we have a really good metric for measuring extinction risk, but extinction is a thing in conservation that we want to avoid. Recovery of species is what we want to achieve, but there was not a standardized way of thinking about species recovery to date. And so the green list of species would be a new metric that looks at how close to recovery is a species and how close can we get in the future. Now, of course, to do this, you need to define what recovery means, which, as you might imagine, is no small task. There's a lot of different opinions that need to be considered, a lot of different voices in the room. So in 2013, a task force was established and global consultations were carried out for the next 3 or 4 years. And just to highlight some of the key players in that task force, so there was a core team that I joined personally in 2017, but essentially the people on the screen, including Craig, including Mike Hoffman, including Rich Jenkins here in this building as well, would meet monthly and discuss and push the project forward. We also had a much wider task force that was funded and partnered with lots of different organizations, including CCI. So the work was supported by a lot of different corners of the conservation community. And so the task force members also were wider than just that core team. So that task force moved along, held global consultations for 3 to 4 years. And as a result of those consultations, the whole idea was, can we figure out a standardized way to define recovery in a way that mostly makes sense? By 2018, we thought we had that answer, and we published a green list of species framework. That framework was a paper published in Conservation Biology, wherein we described the basic method of the green list of species assessment. The idea of publishing the framework was to invite comment from the scientific community and the conservation community, which could then be acted upon before we officially published guidance within IUCN. And so in that framework paper, we described the 2 aims of the green list of species method and also the methods that would be used to achieve those aims. So the 2 aims were to measure species recovery in a standardized way, but then also we added something else on, which was within that framework of species recovery, assess the impact of and incentivize conservation action. So how did it do this? First of all, I'll talk about how the green list of species defines species recovery. So in our paper, we've published what we considered our definition of what a fully recovered species was. So we consider a species fully recovered if it is viable and ecologically functional in each part of its indigenous range. You'll notice some little dots there. I haven't given the full definition. There might be some questions that come up at the end relating to this, but for the purposes of a seminar, I didn't want to get into too much technical detail. So this is our basic definition of what a fully recovered species is. And obviously, there is a lot of jargon in that definition, which I will come to. But if we can just hold off on that for a second and think about this definition of a fully recovered species relative to our sort of hypothetical axis of recovery to functional levels. If we just turn that outside, make it into a y-axis and call that something called a species recovery score, then if we take our definition of a fully recovered species, if a species completely met that definition, it would get a 100% on that species recovery axis. And if it was extinct in the wild, it would get a 0%. So kind of conceptually, that's what we're thinking about. The species recovery score ranges from 0 to 100, reflects the degree to which a species meets this definition of full recovery. Now, of course, most species are not going to be at that fully recovered definition, unfortunately. They're going to be falling somewhere along that spectrum, somewhere along that percent from 0 to 100. And so one thing that you could do is simply report the numerical score, which is interesting information in itself. But we took a leaf out of the Red List book. We also applied categories to quantify different bands of those possible scores and make them slightly more resonant, I think, and easier to communicate. So there are now categories analogous to the Red List extinction risk categories, going from 100% a fully recovered or non-depleted species, going down towards 0 through the categories slightly depleted, moderately depleted, largely depleted, critically depleted, and then at 0, extinct in the wild. So this is the basic framework of how recovery is being measured. And what this means is that with the development of a green list of species, we now have expanded the language of conservation when we're talking about a species status. So rather than simply talking about the extinction risk of a species, we now have language to talk about the recovery status of a species as well. Why might this be interesting or important? Well, for one thing, there are species that are not at risk of extinction, that nonetheless we might consider very far from recovery. So we have if we have a species that has exhibited a very large past decline, but has since stabilized and maybe is even increasing, that species would very rightly be considered not at risk of extinction on the red list. There's not a probability that species is going to go extinct in the very near future. That probability is very low. So it makes sense that it's these concerns. However, that species could be considered depleted from a recovery standpoint. So now we have that official designation to talk about those sort of two different sides of the conservation story of the species. Alternatively, there are some species that will always have some inherent risk of extinction, have always been narrow endemics, have always existed in a restricted range or restricted numbers, but have persisted that way, happily through millennia. And so even though the red list recognizes correctly that there is always some inherent extinction risk of that species, it could well be considered only slightly depleted or maybe even fully recovered if really no change has happened over the past centuries. So hopefully I've convinced you that this is a worthwhile thing to do. So how do you actually go about and do it? How is this species recovery score calculated? So now I'm going to break down those different parts of our definition of full recovery. And I'll start with the concept of indigenous range. So a species is fully recovered if it is one component is if it is found throughout its indigenous range. So the indigenous range of a species is its known or inferred distribution prior to major human impacts. And we can have long debates about when to set that baseline. Long debates were had about how we set those baselines, but essentially we're looking at human impacts from 1500 CE onward to keep the general framework relevant to modern conservation action. What this means is that if you were to do a green list assessment for a species, you would be considering not just the area where a species is found today, but you would be considering the areas where a species was found prior to major human impacts that affected the distribution or abundance of that species. So when we're thinking about the depletion of a species, that's sort of where that idea comes from. Another part of our definition is that a species should be viable and functional throughout each part of its indigenous range. What we mean by that is the idea is that you would divide the indigenous range of a species into parts called spatial units. And the idea of spatial units is that we want to capture variation across the range in species status, but also incentivize conservation and recovery across the range. So I'm sure if you can think of, a species that you're familiar with, its status is not necessarily consistent across its range. There's going to be variation. The idea with spatial units is that it allows our assessment to capture that variation and feed that into calculating the final species recovery score. So as an example of that, the leatherback turtle is broken into natural genetic groups. And so if we were trying to do an assessment for the leatherback turtle, which in fact the marine turtle specialist group is in the process of doing, you might divide the range of the species along these genetic lines and look at how the species is doing in each of these different subsections of the range. The next part of the recovery definition is the idea of viability. This one's pretty straightforward, especially if you know a lot about IUCN. Because we are part of the red list after all. So a species is viable in a spatial unit if it meets the criteria for not being threatened, essentially, using the criteria of the red list. So that one's pretty straightforward. And then finally, this idea that a species should be ecologically functional in each part of its indigenous range. This is a really exciting part of the assessment. It's also potentially the trickiest part of the assessment. How do you measure ecological function of an individual species across its range? What we mean by an ecologically functional species is one that exhibits its full range of ecological interactions, functions, and other roles in the ecosystem. And for some species, especially strongly interacting species, it can be somewhat straightforward to identify when a species is fulfilling its function or not. So we've all heard the classic example in our textbooks of the sea otter exerting control over urchin populations. If sea otter numbers get too low as a predator, the urchins as prey grow too abundant and eat out all of the kelp, turning it into a barren patch of ocean. So that sort of clear sign is a very obvious indicator of ecological functionality of the otter. Is it that clear for most species? Absolutely not. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about how to incorporate this and make it doable for most species on the planet. And so there's a number of ways that you could think about function. You could, if you had a straightforward case like the sea otter, think about, are we observing the function that we expect to see? If it's not so clear cut, you might say, are there any signs that this species is not functioning? Are there signs of dysfunction that we can see that would indicate that the species is not at ecologically appropriate levels? Or use other proxies. So for example, carrying capacity or pre-impact characteristics of a population, assuming that that would represent a functional population. So a bit of a recap of how the green status framework works, which at this time in history was still called the green list. Apologies. The first step is to define the species indigenous range, so it's pre-impact distribution. To divide that range into spatial units to account for any variation in status across the range, and then assess the state in each spatial unit. So we talked about what it means for a spatial unit to be viable or functional. There's two other potential states that could be assigned as well. So if the species is found in a spatial unit, but it is not viable, it's simply present. And if it's been extirpated there, it is called absent. So those are the four states that you could possibly assign. And then finally, you combine that information, the state of the species in each spatial unit. It's kind of a weighted average. That's the cheat that I'm using. It's not exactly a weighted average, but you can think of it like that to produce a green score for the species. And so our green score calculation here, so G is our green score. N in the denominator is the number of spatial units. WF in the denominator is the functional weight. So the weight that you would put if a spatial unit was meeting those criteria for being functional. And then the WS in the top is the actual weights that you observe in your spatial units. What this basically means is that if all of your spatial units were actually functional, the numerator would match the denominator, and you would have a score of 100%, so a fully recovered species. If, as in most cases, there is a range of different weights in the numerator, that is going to make it smaller in the denominator, and you'll have somewhere on the spectrum from 0 to 100. So if every spatial unit was absent in the numerator, you'd have your green score of 0%, so extinct or extinct in the wild. And so this green score that I've just calculated or showed how it can be calculated, when it's calculated with actual observations, so how the species is doing at the time of the assessment, we call that the species recovery score. And that is the main output, or the first primary output of a green list of species assessment. So what is the recovery status now? And as I mentioned, that can be translated into a recovery category as well. So you could stop your assessment there if you wanted, but many people who do our assessments like to go into the next step, which gets to the second aim of the green status, which is to assess the impact of and incentivize conservation action. So how do we use the green score to do that? So as I said, the first step is to measure the actual green score at the time of the assessment, the species recovery score. But you could also calculate the expected green score if no conservation action had been taken to date. So the counterfactual green score. And the difference between those two scores gives you a metric that we call the conservation legacy. So the impact of past conservation on the species. And you can imagine how this would be quite a useful metric to be able to communicate. You could have a species that you have put a lot of funding and human effort into its conservation, but its status doesn't seem to really have changed. But if you have a formal metric that shows prevented declines, avoided declines, that can also be a way to celebrate conservation success. You can also calculate the green score 10 years into the future, the expected green score 10 years in the future, if conservation continues as planned. So you have your action plan for the species, these are the actions we're going to be doing. Where do we expect the green score to go as a result of those actions? And that gives you a metric called the conservation gain, which can be quite motivating to people working on the ground, to funders, to see what sort of change might you expect within that time frame. You can also do the opposite and think about if we stopped conservation today, what would happen to that green score. And the difference between the current score and this without conservation green score gives you a metric called the conservation dependence. So this can be a way to incentivize continued funding for a species. Sometimes if we see a conservation success, there's the feeling that maybe we can just stop there. We've done our job, but actually without continued funding, you might see a backslide in that species status. So this is a formal metric to help capture that. And then finally, we have a metric called recovery potential. And this is calculated by thinking within the next 100 years, if everything went right, if we had all the funding that we needed, if we had the political support that we needed, and our only constraints were the biological realities of the species and on the ground, what is the maximum possible green score that we can achieve for the species? And this is a way of sort of showing the space that conservation can work in. It's not a goal in itself, but it can be used to help inspire more ambitious conservation goals. And if you're curious about how we think about these counterfactuals and scenarios, obviously I cannot go into a ton of detail in a seminar today, but we have published a paper about how we recommend that assessors do approach these counterfactuals and scenarios. So going back to our timeline, so we published this framework in 2018, and then between 2018 and 2021, we were testing the framework. So essentially calling in volunteers from around the world, experts on species from every taxon you could think of, to try out these methods on their species to see if they worked, if they didn't, what they would want to change to make it more applicable to their species, a better sort of user experience overall. And that culminated in a paper where we published the results of those tests. And I should say that, you know, a lot of the testers were CCI members as well. So I'm sure people in this room were involved in this. So thank you very much. And in the end, we had more than 200 collaborators testing the framework from 38 different countries, obviously some gaps in that map still. And one of the big bits of feedback that we got through this testing process was that we needed to rebrand. So you'll remember that originally we were called the Green List of Species. It was from that IUCN resolution calling for green lists. But because the Green List of Protected and Conserved Areas got out of the gate so quickly, it had already established itself as what it meant to be a green list. And actually, the method is very different. So the Green List of Protected and Conserved Areas is essentially saying, is a protected area following good practice or is it not? It's a certification scheme, as Craig said. And as you can tell from what I've just described, the Green List of Species, as it was developed, takes a very different approach. And so we decided that we would rebrand from a green list to a green status of species. And actually, the Green List of Ecosystems has done the same. So the Green Status of Ecosystems will be coming soon. And so we published our results in this paper. And I really like this GIF that's coming up, because there were over 200 authors on this paper. One of our incentives for getting people to test the framework was offering them authorship on our testing paper, which in my opinion is very rightly deserved. But what did we learn from this testing of species across the globe? So in the end, for this framework paper, this testing paper, we were able to evaluate 181 species. The normal biases that you might expect, we had a decent terrestrial bias, lower representation of freshwater and marine species, although we did make hard efforts to try and make that more representative. Of those 181 species, as usual, again, bit of a vertebrate bias, although we did get invertebrates, fungi, and fungi represented. We also made a really big effort to make sure that we were sampling across red list categories as well, because we wanted to know, are we actually adding information, or are we just doing a red list assessment in reverse, which is what we didn't want to do, because that would just be a waste of people's time. And we were happy to find that the species recovery score, so that sort of main output, percent of fully recovered, is correlated with the red list category, but it's not perfectly predicted by it. So you can imagine there would be some correlation. If a species is critically endangered, existing in a small population, it may also be very far from recovery. But there are there's lots of noise in that data. So that green line across the center at 50% represents species across every red list category. So least concern to critically endangered there on the x-axis. Different red list categories all showing the same species recovery score. And so you can have species like the antique and racer, which we actually did in collaboration with FFI here, that is a critically endangered species, but has that sort of that green score here. So it's only a moderately depleted species, even though it's considered critically endangered. Then we have a mangrove, Candelia obovata, that is least concern, but has that same score as the antique and racer, moderately depleted. And then finally, you have interesting cases like the burrowing bettong, which is a near threatened species. So not in one of those higher extinction risk categories, but it had one of the lower species recovery scores that we observed. So it's a critically depleted species. So hopefully I'm starting to convince you that the green status is adding new information to the red list category. And you can't predict a species recovery score just by knowing its red list category alone. And then thinking about those 4 conservation impact metrics: legacy, dependence, gain, and recovery potential. So apologies for the busy graphs, but again, we have our red list extinction categories on the x-axis, and then the value of those conservation impact metrics on the y. And what I want to highlight here is the trends across red list categories, which we tested for whether there were significant trends or not. And I should say that when it comes to conservation legacy, dependence, and gain, species across all the different red list categories were showing those impacts of conservation. It's not like it's only for threatened species that you can show this conservation impact for. For recovery potential, as you might expect, the farther a species is from recovery, the more room it has to grow. So we did see a trend there. But we saw conservation impacts observed regardless of red list category. And actually, only 3 species out of the 181 that we tested showed 0 conservation impact across these 4 metrics. So for most species, at least one of those 4 metrics was showing either past or potential future impact of conservation on that species, which I think is a really encouraging story to be able to tell. And only 14 of the 181 species were indeterminate across those 4 metrics. So I haven't mentioned it at all in this talk, but of course, if you're doing an assessment like this, there has to be uncertainty incorporated. If that uncertainty is great enough, then these metrics come out as indeterminate. But that was only the case for 14 of our 181 species. And 91% of our species showed past or expected impact of conservation, as I said, which I think is quite encouraging. So moving forward in time to 2021, this was when we globally launched the green status of species. It became an official IUCN knowledge product, endorsed by IUCN. And it was endorsed to great fanfare, which was very exciting. There was lots of press coverage of it, lots of interest from the conservation community. And where have we gone from there? We've begun publishing green status assessments on the Red List website. So if you go to the Red List website today, you will see a small but growing number of species that have had their green status assessed, and that is communicated alongside the Red List category. And I will tell you what our ambitions are for a number of assessments in a minute, but that number is only going to grow. We've also developed an online training course. So if you or someone you know might be interested in doing a green status assessment yourself, we do have a fully functional online training course that I highly recommend. Here's a little screenshot of what it looks like. And there's little checks for understanding as you go through as well. So if you want to test, am I really getting what the assessment is all about? That's built into the online training course. We also have all of our materials available online in English, French, and Spanish. So you're very welcome to check those out if you like. And as I very briefly alluded to, with those online materials, we have the data entry workbooks that you can use to actually do the assessment and make the computations. You don't have to do the maths yourself. But in that online workbook, the uncertainty is taken into account. So for every step of the assessment, you are entering your uncertainty in those evaluations. and the outputs are calculated automatically for you. For those in the know, this will become part of SIS, which is IUCN's internal database system, very, very soon. We've just been using a different data entry method until that's been set up. So what's next? So by 2025, we have a goal as a working group and a task force of completing 5,000 green status of species assessments. Why have we set ourselves this goal? Well, for one thing, it's part of the Red List strategic plan, so it's sort of an internal IUCN initiative. We want to have enough assessments to understand recovery at a representative scale globally. So obviously we can't, even with 5,000 assessments, we're not nearly approximating the biodiversity that we see on this planet of animals, plants, and fungi, but it's a start. Another reason why we have this ambitious goal is that the green status of species has been listed as an indicator for the global biodiversity framework. So it's a component indicator for target 4 and a complementary indicator for goal B. And so we're really happy about this. You know, with thinking about the Convention on Biological Diversity, the idea is to achieve net gain through restoration and recovery. And so the green status plays really well into those global goals. But unless we have enough assessments, we can't, usefully feed into this global biodiversity framework. So some good news on that score is that we have secured funding to bring someone into CCI itself, into the Red List unit. Some of you may have met Magda in this building, to oversee assessment processing, which has been fantastic. So to date, we've got a little over 900 assessments in review, planned, or waiting on funding. But we're trying to increase that pipeline, of course. So if you are interested or know someone who might be, you're very welcome to scan this QR code to just be directed to some of the links that I've mentioned to learn more, and possibly register your interest in taking an assessment, doing an assessment. There's a number of reasons you might be interested in doing this. For example, if you are interested in demonstrating conservation optimism, and you want to demonstrate the impact that conservation has had on a species, this can be a fantastic way to do that formally. To increase the conservation ambition for a species, so thinking about what is actually the recovery potential of a species, or how far from recovery is it currently, and should we be doing more as a conservation community? Or if you're a pure ecologist and want to simply explore loss and recovery of functions, this is a really useful framework for doing that as well. So I might put that QR code back up in a minute. But I'll just end by thanking everyone on the task force, all of our partners and donors. Thank you very much to Ash for inviting me to speak, and for Greg for your wonderful introduction. And thank you all for listening.
Thanks very much, Molly. And I'm sure as everybody heard from the way Molly was speaking, she has retained her optimism. So I'll open up for any questions.
I'm curious. So the idea of I'm interested in the idea of the indigenous range. Implies that all species incorporated into the assessment have been, in terms of their range, been negatively impacted by human activities. And obviously there are certain species which have benefited and done very well from human activity, things like rats and raccoons. How could these be captured or incorporated into the data when it's about recovery to a certain baseline, which might actually have been far exceeded and enhanced?
That's a fantastic question. You'll be happy to know we have thought about it. I didn't think I had time to cover it in the talk, but fantastic question. So our definition of indigenous range also incorporates natural expansions or translocations since that benchmark date. So, rats are a great example, coyotes in North America, birds that have benefited from agricultural expansion, for example. So sort of natural expansions or conservation translocations since that point are also included in our concept of indigenous range. I think it's also important to note that the green status is not necessarily advocating conservation towards some sort of historical ideal. It's really just a benchmark. And the framework also incorporates an idea called expected additional range, which is that ... in the definition that I left out because I didn't know how much time we'd have. But the idea is when you're looking forward, trying to assess the recovery potential of a species, you obviously need to be considering where the species is likely to move due to climate or other changes, or where there might be translocations outside of the native range for conservation purposes. So yeah, fantastic question.
we've been struggling, or some of us been struggling with favourable conservation status since the 1990s, the EU Habitats Directive. And I wonder how your recovery success differs from that, or is that the same thing?
There's definite parallels, I would say, between kind of EU favourable conservation status and what we're doing with the green status. In my mind, there's sort of analogs between what we consider a functional population of a species and a species with favourable conservation status. But it's something that I think we do definitely need to explore those links further, because I think there's synergies there and potential sort of confusion that we'd want to avoid as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for another lovely talk. I was interested in some of those metrics, like is it conservation legacy, the difference between, so do you distinguish between, so say there's a score of 10, and it's the difference between 0 and 10 versus 90 and 100. Yeah. Is there a difference between that's distinguished?
There is actually. So just like the species recovery score gets slotted into categories of, fully recovered down through the different levels of depletion, our conservation impact metrics also get categories ranging from high to low to 0, negative, or indeterminate. And so actually that is one of the main distinctions. So a species where a decline of 10% was avoided, but you're going from 100% to 90% would be considered a relatively low conservation legacy. Prevent a decline where a species would be going from 10% to 0% would be considered in our framework a high conservation legacy. So the scope definitely matters.
Is there any part of the green status that takes into account like the genetic variability?
Yes, so we are having conversations with the conservation genetics specialist group about this. We think that one of the ways that we could incorporate this is in the idea of functionality. So if we know that a population has lost a lot of genetic diversity, that could potentially be a sign that it is not at a functional level. But it's not sort of officially in our framework yet. If you have ideas, I'd love to chat with you later.
Just to add something on the framework. So Molly talked about the standard. So that's a 25-page little booklet. We don't want to keep modifying the standard, because if you modify the standard, that means you have to reassess everything you've just assessed. So like we do with the red list, we have a living document to the guidelines. I don't know how many pages the guidelines is now, but
too many.
Yeah. The idea is that as new scenarios come forward, as new issues arise, you can then address them through the guidelines and try to come up with a solution. So that's where the genetics work will feed into each version of the guidelines.
Absolutely.
Great talk, thank you very much. Can I just ask, so I think the IUCN Red List also has a data deficient category, which I guess is relatively simple for species, traditional way. This has obviously lots of criteria. So I'm just interested to know whether the threshold around kind of whether the data is considered just deficient and you can't do it, and which bits of that, all those criteria, are frequently the hold up.
So at this stage, we don't have a data deficient category for the green status. But if, for example, you had no knowledge of Indigenous range, then that would possibly preclude you from doing an assessment. You could kind of consider it data deficient that way. But we do have an indeterminate category for the species recovery score and for all of our different conservation impact metrics. For the species recovery score, that's if the uncertainty in that score is more than 40%. Then that is considered an indeterminate. The uncertainty is always reported, even if it's not in the indeterminate category, though.
I was wondering, in an age of misinformation, how do you view the risk of the score being misinterpreted on purpose or not by general public media to kind of confuse what our need to do is and not what we should do?
Yeah. Can you think of like a specific scenario where that?
Well, I'm thinking Netherlands, where I'm from, when they had food label, and within certain categories, they would tell you the most healthy option. So the most healthy option of crisps, obviously crisps aren't healthy, but generally people took to it, oh, well, this is the healthy crisp, this is healthy food. Just wondering, if there's a debate about where money needs to be spent, and let's say a populist party says, oh, well, actually, this is only moderately depleted, so we're not taking any action. Is that on the radar at all?
I think that's the challenge with any sort of conservation information that you face. The red list as well faces similar challenges. But I guess one thing to think about, even though it may not provide too much change to the scenario you're talking about, is that the red list and the green status are meant to be purely scientific assessments, right? They're telling us something about the state of the world. They're not necessarily recommending any particular course of action. That's up to decision makers to decide how they want to use that information. One of the reasons that we wanted to introduce the green status was to reduce the possibility of misinformation when you only tell sort of one side of the conservation story. So the classic example is when pandas, the giant panda, was downlisted from endangered to vulnerable. There was a lot of uproar because people thought that that would be misinterpreted. You know, the panda is not endangered anymore. We don't need to do anything else for it. But if we have a green status showing that it's depleted, that it has a high conservation dependence, then that really helps round out that narrative. So we're hoping it will decrease misinformation rather than increase, but communication is always a challenge for sure.
I was wondering how much of a handle you think you have on indigenous ranges from 1500. So I imagine for some species it's probably much easier than for others, and I assume that you need them for all of the species. And like, what kind of information goes into informing what that indigenous range is?
For some species, it's much more straightforward. So especially species that are commercially valuable, we have logbooks, trade records, that sort of thing. So, you know, sometimes, you know, maps already exist. In other cases, you are having to think about the ecological requirements of a species. So if you can map its habitat across time, is that a good enough proxy for indigenous range? There's people looking into using species distribution modeling to sort of backcast what that range would be. Actually, some of my work is with historical ecologists and paleobiologists, trying to see if we can combine those data sources to better inform species distribution models to backcast indigenous range. But there's not a simple answer to your question, but a variety of methods can be used to infer what the range would be.
Thanks, Molly. Really good stuff. I was wondering, in terms of the parallel with the red list, could you give us a sort of an idea of how do they compare logistically in terms of which one takes longer? And also, if you see that causing additional kind of logistical issues when in effect you're sort of drawing on the same pool of assessors who already are really time constricted.
Absolutely. This is something that we are very conscious of. So for those who don't know, though I'm sure most people in this room know, it can be very time consuming to do red list assessments alone, let alone adding green assessments on top of it. Obviously, the green status is new, so there's a learning curve. And by that fact alone, it takes longer. But we did look at this when we were doing our testing, and the time that it takes to do an assessment ranges from sort of a draft assessment ranges from about 30 minutes to a couple of days. So it depends on how much information is known for the species. Also, you know, assessors could just stop after calculating that species recovery score. They don't necessarily have to calculate the impact metrics unless they think that's valuable to the conservation story of the species. Most assessors do choose to calculate all four, but they could just stop after understanding the current species recovery category. So I think there's ways that we can reduce that burden on assessors for sure.
Just sort of following on from that, I wonder if there's ways that you could sort of, I don't know, build platforms to sort of help people both do the red list and the green status, so that like quite a lot of the kind of global data sets are sort of pulled together and sort of leading people into it, and they just have to maybe fill in the kind of more localized information that they have access to.
Yeah, absolutely. We're constantly considering the ways that we can sort of synergize existing information and make the process as easy as possible. There's lots of different ways that different sort of taxonomic groups do red list assessment, so it's not as straightforward as sort of like one platform, but I completely take your point that there's, I think, always more that we can be doing to make this as easy a process as possible.
Do you want to comment on the use of these system for national assessments?
Yeah, so everything I've talked about, the development was really done thinking at the global level. But obviously for a lot of national and international policy, thinking about recovery at the national level and conservation impact at the national level is really important. And so we are starting to develop methods to either disaggregate a global score down into national impact, or to look within one country itself and say within that country, what is the recovery status of the species relative to a baseline? So this is, new work that we're starting to think about, and I think is going to be really important in the next decade.
Well, hopefully you'll feel enthused about green status assessments and have captured the QR code, and I'll put your names forward to do one or more, hopefully, species for us. But thanks all for coming, and see you outside for further questions.